Welcome everyone to another study of And So It Begins. My name is Lindsey and my guest today, as you can maybe see, is McCollum. And we today are going to talk about Genesis 32 and just the way that we struggle with God and Jacob struggles with God, and really just understand how God's story and our stories fit together, and get to hear Will's story as well of his faith and just where everything began and just understanding how that fits. And so to begin, I just want to give us a little bit of context of Genesis 32 in the story of Jacob. Now, some of you might know this is way after Jacob, the whole Jacob and Esau, and the confusion about marriage with Leah and Rachel as well. So already we just see this dysfunctional Jacob going crazy wild in Genesis, and then we come to this wrestling with God. Now, when we hear this, Jacob is by himself in this very vulnerable position, and we see this a few times before, and we'll discuss in the next few moments just that parallel between Esau and Jacob, and the wrestling with God and Jacob as well, and how they kind of fit together in all of this. And maybe even Jacob thought Esau was God or this human form and all that stuff because it was night. But let's go ahead and read this passage. So if you want to turn to your Bibles, Genesis 32, verses 22 through 32. That night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions, so Jacob was left alone, and the man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed from Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. That's a weird phrasing to end with all of that. But what, Will, where do you see God, or what kind of verses stick out to you in this?
Well, it stuck out to me right at the beginning. 2 wives, 2 female servants, 11 sons. I can see why he stayed on the other side of the river. But then the wrestling, we all have times that we wrestle in our life, and how do you get past that and then asking the person you're wrestling with to bless you?
Right.
Like, well, okay, had he figured it out at that point?
Yeah.
Was it God, or was it just common to ask the guy you're wrestling with to bless you?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
So I don't.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think definitely something that stood out with me is this idea of daybreak. Like I thought, was like this man a vampire or something that he couldn't see? Or like, what was this? And reading and researching about it, again, this passage doesn't say like he was wrestling with God. But remember this idea of God, you can't really see him face to face because of just the glory of God. We see that with Moses and Elijah and that still small voice and God kind of moving. So in this, God is actually protecting Jacob, and that's why he leaves at daybreak. And I was like, oh, I guess that makes sense. And also, like you said, this idea of like asking for his name. And of course, God never actually answering him. He asks a question and you're like, oh, of course.
Well, sometimes I feel that way in my life, Are you going to answer God?
Yeah, I need just more
and I'm
questions.
Like, is no an answer? Is yes an answer?
Yeah.
Where are we at?
Right, yeah. No, for sure. And I think it's all just, a bit crazy in this idea of chaos and wrestling. But then does like God relent and give up? Or does Jacob give up? Or like, is there like an actual winner in this and stuff? So I think, like you said, it gives us just more questions and answers. But how do you think this chapter or these verses kind of apply to today?
Well, I think today, we're wrestling with how do we move on with life, you know? Jacob wrestled all night and and apparently put up a good fight with God, you know, because
yeah, for sure.
he had to touch his hip to to keep him from winning.
Yeah.
And so, but then we turn around and we're like, well, what can we do now? You know, everything has changed.
For sure.
And so the struggle is, how do we be friends with people when we can't get together like we used to? Sure. And that's a struggle in my life because I'm an in-person person. Yeah. You know, I don't want to do the internet, you know. I don't. I'd prefer not to do on the phone. Right. I'd rather come talk to you in person. Yeah. And so that's a struggle, you know. And I wrestle with, how do I make friendships still be strong in this time?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think for me, seeing just God's relentless pursuit, like I know it's wrestling, but there's this compassion that God has and continues just to wrestle with Jacob. Like, will Jacob actually have faith in wanting to receive this blessing if God doesn't continue to like love him in this, I guess, for me, or to just hold fast and God never turns away, and nor does Jacob. He demands this blessing. And so I think kind of almost that wrestling becomes this like relentless pursuit of one another, of God continuing to fight Jacob, or God continuing to wrestle with Jacob, and that love, and also kind of vice versa. And where's God continuing to do that in just all of our current events, of God just continuing to be with us in this. So yeah, no, I think that's totally right. Of where do we see God and where is He at? But how does this story relate to your own story, or where did you kind of begin?
Okay, so to begin you got to go back to the beginning, okay?
Are we talking like caveman? Like
no, not that beginning. The beginning of me, okay? So the beginning of me.
Was there running water at that time?
There was running water. I am the old man on staff, but I'm not that old, okay? So
I just wanted to dispel mysteries. So
I grew up in a family that was very strong in the church, you know, and very early on in our lives, our parents prayed over us and, you know, I guess dedicated us to God, much like Samuel, Hannah and Samuel, you know, and so, you know, apparently it worked, you know, because I've got a brother who's a preacher and a sister who's married to a preacher and very active in the church. And my little brother is, you know, very active in his church. He's the one that went out and made some money, so he can take care of my parents. That's good. Yeah. But and then I ended up in the church. You know, been here 21 years in the church. But so it started out with my parents praying over us, you know, and then I struggled. You know, my brother accepted a call in the pastoral ministry in high school. You know, and you know, being a twin brother, I didn't, you know. I'm like,
do I need to? Is this
so there's a struggle, you know. And that struggle carried on through high school, and it really wasn't, you know, we grew up, like I said, we grew up in the church. If the doors were open, we were there. Even if they weren't, we might be out there mowing the lawn or whatever. And so church life was very natural for me, and but it really wasn't until college that I made my faith my own, you know. And it was kind of a crisis, you know. I thought, well, have I been living a lie? You know, looking back on it, it's just been a journey, you know. And I was on the journey, and I moved forward through that journey, you know, like, you know, maybe early on in the wrestling at night, you know, maybe it's like, why am I wrestling this guy? You know, what's this about? Right, you know, but looking back, you know, it was all part of the journey and is part of who I became, you know. I always, you know, I've always been interested in building, and I came to college, and that was another struggle in my life, you know. I was going to be a civil engineer. Well, high school was easy for me. I never learned how to study, and if you don't learn how to study, you can take engineering, calculus, and chemistry a lot and not make it through. And so, you know, after several times coming back and struggling, going back into engineering, I decided maybe that was a different route I needed to go. And I ended up getting a degree in elementary education, you know, because I enjoy working with kids. Well, as I finished that up, the opportunity became available for me to take a job at the church. And it was in one of my passions, which is building. I love working with my hands and building, and then I discovered over the years that I could work with kids too, and have a wonderful time doing that. And so I've grown in my faith as I've worked at the church. That growth in college was instrumental, but it was still just part of the journey. I wasn't through with the wrestling at night, So here I am. I find myself enjoying my job, working at the church, and I get to serve people and serve God and all that.
For sure, yeah. When you are wrestling, what does that kind of look like, or when do you know when to give up, or is there a time, or do you just run out of strength, or is God putting something in your life?
I think sometimes you just run out of strength, because I'm fairly strong-headed, set in my ways, maybe you might say, and so I think I know how it's going to work. And I went back to civil engineering 3 times, or maybe they didn't take me the 3rd time. I don't remember what it was. But it may have been the 4th time they didn't. And so I thought, I know this is what, even my mom thought I was going to be in civil engineering and end up building churches. Well, she was kind of right. Sure. I didn't get the degree, but, I have, managed to move on and I end up building churches. I've helped build the foundation of 2 churches, and that's awesome. And then we've had quite a bit of construction projects around here that I've been a part of. So life is, God finds the way to get you to where He wants you to be.
For sure. Yeah. Do you have a favorite project or a foundation or something that you've really worked on that you're?
I enjoy, there was 2 mission trips where we actually dug and poured the foundations of churches, and those were some of the favorite trips. I've enjoyed every mission trip I've been on. There's one to Nashville that I got a few too many ticks, but other than that, I think 21 was the count. Some of y'all may remember.
Oh my gosh.
But I've enjoyed working with the other people, getting to meet the other people. And as I've grown, I've noticed, that it's become more about the people than it is the building. The building's just a way for us to work together, but it's getting to know the people that is really, getting to know the people you're wrestling with, Hopefully you're wrestling on the same team.
Yeah, for sure. No, I definitely, agree. And I think, with wrestling with God and what Jacob is doing, they're holding fast to one another, and neither of them are pulling away. And even in your story and that struggle and just these projects and foundations, it's just all about the people. It's all about the unity that we have in our community. For Jacob to be at this deeply vulnerable, at night alone by himself, with his entire 2 wives family in the pack, coming along with him, where he was supposed to lead them. And what does that even look like? And then even in the next chapter of Genesis, we have Jacob and Esau again. And so even in that play, it's really cool to see Jacob and Esau wrestling a few chapters before this, and that struggle for the blessing. And then again, Jacob gets it. But now Jacob and God are wrestling for a blessing, and that kind of pursuit and stuff as well. But we would love to know, what are you wrestling with? What are you fighting with God with? If you want to share, we would love for you to comment below. Or just ways that we can be praying for you. It's a hard time to know where is God pursuing us, and maybe it feels like there are more questions than answers. But if you guys have any questions about this passage, feel free to comment. We'd love to hear, and I would love to research and figure out these questions with you, knowing that the Bible is here to start conversations, to open up conversations, not just to end them, but to just give us a starting point to really understand, how does our story meet God's story, and where do we see that happen in Scripture? So as much as we are apart, we are in this together, knowing that as we begin to regather the church and coming in person, and as we are scattered around the city or even the globe, we're wrestling, but we're doing it together, knowing that we're not alone. God is always here, and we are here with Him. So thank you for joining, and we would love to see you, and comment below prayer requests, anything, questions. We would love to see and start more conversations conversations with you. And don't forget to tune in next week to another study of And So It Begins. See you next time.